with that, let me introduce our guest today. Doug Young is a name and a byline you might recognize from his 10 years at Reuters. He's worked all over China, all over Greater China, reads Chinese, is active on social media in China, one of the journalists who really saw the potential early on for getting a sense of what people are thinking and saying in China by keeping a very close eye on social media, and many others have followed now in his footsteps on that. He's now a financial journalism professor at Fudan University. He's written the book The Party Line, which some of you may have seen at the entrance here. And I hope you all give full attention and look forward to his book as well. With that, Doug Young.
Okie doke. Everybody, okay. All right, I got a lot of ground to cover, so I've been told I have 20 minutes to do it, so I'll try to be quick. First of all, thanks everybody for coming. I know we're close to the holidays and everybody's probably rushing to get everything done, and maybe you don't necessarily have time to come to a talk like this. But I really do think this is a fascinating topic because we're seeing things changing in China right now at a really unprecedented pace in terms of the media. And this is something, obviously I've just done this book on it, but you see a very, very stagnant period, a very traditional period in the first 50 years of Chinese history from 1949 to 2000. And then in this last 10 to 12 years, there are really some big changes taking place. And I think it's an exciting time to be looking at the Chinese media. And a lot of what's happening today is being driven by new media. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my talk here. So you see a lot of it's really happened even really within the last 5 years with the takeoff of social media. And that would be things like Weibo, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. There's another hot product out there called Weixin, which some of you may have heard of, is another one. And these are really shaking things up. So let's do very quickly, just give you a little bit about me. Keith already introduced me real quickly, but I've been at Fudan University for the last 2 years teaching financial journalism there. And it's been fascinating. If any of you have any questions, what it's like to teach in a Chinese journalism school, feel free to ask those at the end. I can give you some interesting stories about what the students are like, but they're generally a really, really good bunch. Fudan has got one of the oldest journalism schools in China. Actually, I think it might be the oldest. And then I've just written this book that Keith mentioned before. I used to work at Reuters. I worked at Reuters for 10 years from 2000 to 2010. And a lot of that time I was reporting on company news, so I continue to do that on my own blog, doing mostly commentary these days, talking a lot about that. Before that, I lived in Los Angeles, and I actually also have the sort of unusual distinction of having lived and worked in China back in the 1980s, from 1986 to 91, and I was actually up in Beijing during the whole Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989, so very different perspective on now versus then. Okay. So we're going to talk about social media today and sort of how it's changing the Chinese media dialogue, the dialogue in society. So I just want to give you a few numbers to start, just to show you how explosive the media has, the internet specifically has grown in China. And I didn't put any mobile numbers. Well, I did put one mobile number down at the bottom here, but a lot of what's happening is really being also driven by the huge explosion in cellular, in mobile phone usage. So you can see from here, back in 1997, which, at that point, the West was already fairly advanced in internet. China only had 1,500 websites. Today we see 2.5 million websites, so that number has grown quite big. And then in terms of internet users, we've gone from 620,000 in 1997 to 538 million, which they usually update the number twice a year. So that's the figure as of, I think, mid 2012. But anyhow, you can see the numbers are huge. It's almost, actually it's probably about half of Chinese people now use the internet. Then just going down to the bottom thing on usage trends. One thing that's really interesting about China is that you've just got this huge base of people using the mobile internet on their cell phones. And if you ever go out anywhere, like on the subways or buses or walking on the streets, just especially in a big city like Shanghai, which is where I live, you just see everybody accesses the internet over their cell phones these days and tablet PCs. Okay, so you can see looking at China's internet, it's gotten quite big. Next thing I want to talk about is sort of how the social media has evolved in China, because I think this is really important to understand what's happening now. Okay, so to do this, we're going to backtrack to first 2009. Facebook and Twitter are the two sort of big social media in the West. And in 2009, I imagine a lot of you were probably in Hong Kong at the time. It was fairly big news. They just suddenly blocked Twitter and Facebook. Just as these two big social networking sites were taking off, they blocked them in China. And there was later on a bit of discussion about why they blocked it then. So a lot of people were saying they blocked it because it was just before, it was a couple of months, 3-4 months before the 20th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square crackdown. So that was sort of, a lot of people saw that as the direct reason for it being blocked. There was also some unrest in Tibet happening at the time. But the bottom line is they were blocked. And what happened after that is in 2009, 2010, and up till now, you've just had this huge explosion in these homegrown companies. And anybody who has spent time playing around on Chinese social media probably knows who these are. Sina Weibo is like the one that everybody talks about, but there's also NetEase Weibo. Weibo just means microblog. So there's Sina microblog, NetEase microblog is another big one. Tencent microblog is yet another big one. And then there are also some more, those are more like Twitter. Then there's a few that are sort of more similar to Facebook, one of those being a company called Kaixin, another company called Renren. And these companies have really come in and filled in this vacuum that was left by the shutting out of these Western sites. And it's interesting because what you need to realize when you look at what happened here is the big difference between these local sites and Facebook and Twitter is that these local sites were all locally based. Okay? They were all in China. They were all Chinese companies. But more importantly, they were based in China. They were based off Chinese servers. And this was really important because it gave Beijing and China and the propaganda ministry the ability to control these guys. One of the things that they were really worried about with Twitter and Facebook was that they couldn't control them because Twitter and Facebook were all based offshore, and therefore they're not subject to Chinese laws, not Chinese self-censorship. That was the big issue with Google. Google was subject to Chinese laws because it was based in China, and they said, forget it. We don't want to do this China stuff, so they moved everything down here to Hong Kong, and they don't have to do that anymore. All right, so China, just again to understand the central government's attitude towards social media, it's really important to understand that all these local players were much more controllable than Twitter and Facebook. And in my view, again, they don't tell people what they're thinking, but in my view, that's a big reason why they were allowed to, to develop and become big forces in China. Anyhow, in early 2012, so we're going to skip ahead to this year, and again, I'm sure a lot of you read about this. Things started getting a little out of control at one point because there were all these rumors going around in social media. Specifically around the time of the Bo Xilai scandal, there were a whole bunch of rumors going around about a coup happening in Beijing, and tanks were rolling into Beijing. I imagine most of you saw these reports. But Beijing, the leaders in Beijing really started to freak out again that they were losing control of the situation, and that these rumors, because people could spread rumors without, under this cloak of anonymity. So the government stepped in and said, we're going to require everybody to use their real names, and that put a real damper on things, because people aren't going to want to maybe gossip and be as critical when their real names are being used. But anyhow, what's happened since then, it's been interesting. If you look at what's happened, very few of the social media sites have actually strictly enforced this real name requirement, and instead they've taken other sort of smaller steps to try to clean up their sites of some of this more gossipy, maybe material that's designed to get people all worked up and so forth. And so there's sort of been a little bit of a truce, I guess, in what's happening now. And you don't see, again, I think we see the central government getting comfortable again with the situation. So now what I want to do quickly is jump to 3 case studies, so we can just talk quickly about how these individual cases evolved in the social media and why. So, first study, I think you've probably heard about all 3 of these cases. The first study was this one, it happened last year, involving a woman named Guo Meimei. And what happened was, this woman, she was a young woman, I think around 20 years old. She claimed on her Weibo that she worked for a unit of the Red Cross, or it sounded like it had a name that made it sound like she worked for a part of the Red Cross. It's called Red Cross Commerce. And you can see from this picture here, she had all sorts of claims about like driving around in expensive cars and buying expensive handbags and this and that, basically leading a very lavish lifestyle. And what happened was, people on the internet, just sort of randomly picked her out, because she wasn't a particularly famous person, but they started raising questions about why a woman, who's supposedly working for a nonprofit organization like the Red Cross should be leading such a lavish lifestyle. And the whole thing just blew up. It started on social media, but it really worked its way back into the traditional media as well. And you just got all sorts of debate. You got the Red Cross came under attack. They started getting all defensive. So the people on the internet started uncovering all these things about the Red Cross, about forced donations, excessive spending, just all sorts of stuff. It turned into this huge thing. And in the end, you ended up with a public that was very wary of charities and sort of just the whole concept of giving to charity. It's like, where's our money going? Is it financing this woman's lavish lifestyle? So what's interesting about this case that I want to point out is not so much the details, but the fact that the case was allowed to unfold in new media and eventually make its way back into traditional media, because the government could have said enough at any time, and they have done that in cases, and they could have stopped it. Okay, but in this case, it really was allowed to play out, take its full course. And the reason I think that it was allowed to do this was because it involved the Red Cross, which is not a government organization, involved, I think the central leaders in Beijing realized that this mistrust of charities is a really big issue. So I think somebody in Beijing sat down and said, hey, this is an issue we've got to tackle. There's this whole business with charities and mistrust. At the same time, this isn't an attack on the Communist Party. It's not an attack on the central government. Let's let it go. Okay, so that's the first case. Second case, you probably all remember too, this happened in the middle of last year, which was this collision of a couple of high-speed rail cars. This happened in July of last year. And in the end, more than 30 people were killed and another 200 plus were injured. And I don't know if you all remember, it happened near a city called Wenzhou, and I think there was a signal issue, and one train rear-ended another one. So that's what happened. And following this collision, there was just huge discussion just popped up on the social media. Everybody was talking about it. There were all these horrific pictures popping up, people people were wondering how this could have happened, and the debate quickly began turning really negative. There were all sorts of allegations of cover-up, that the government was sacrificing safety, in its rush to build out this network. And what happened, if you were in China at that time, you would have seen that about 4 or 5 days into this debate, it just stopped, okay? And it stopped, okay, all right, let's speed up here. It stopped because the government decided it was too close to home, is my particular take on it. That this high-speed rail project was a big government project, big spending priority. It involved a government agency, and they just didn't want it to go on. So all posts were deleted, everything, all mentions of it were stopped on the internet. Let's go through this one real quickly. This is the third case, is this case of this guy named Yang Dacai. He was a local provincial official in Shanxi, and he was filmed at the site of a really bad accident. And the reason he first attracted attention was because he was smiling in the pictures, and people thought he shouldn't be smiling at such a bad accident. But what people noticed afterwards was that he was wearing a very expensive watch. And they started doing some digging, and they uncovered all these other pictures of him wearing other expensive watches. And the result was that about a month later, he actually got kicked out of the Communist Party. People were questioning, well, how could he be affording these? He got kicked out of the Communist Party and fired. And this is a real interesting case because it was a case where the discussion was allowed. Unlike the second case, the high-speed rail was allowed to go on the internet. And it actually resulted in real action. In this case, the guy being fired and kicked out of the Communist Party. In my view, again, this is a reflection of the fact that the government has decided it wants to tackle corruption. This was a healthy way for them to sort of implement that policy, and at the same time, it was a low enough level official that they felt comfortable letting this happen on the internet and through social media. And again, it eventually found its way back to traditional media. So I just put this slide in here because I think this is really key to understanding what's happening here. It's all about maintaining control. As long as the government feels that it can maintain control, it's really willing to let things tick up a notch, and it's willing to let the media be used for other things besides the traditional stuff you see. So on that note, I just wanted to end this by saying, well, so what is going to happen? What are we going to see on the agenda for the next 10 years, and how is social media playing into that? Well, I think these first 2 points that I show on here are very traditional uses of the media in Chinese, recent Chinese history. Anybody who looked at a newspaper, as little as 20 years ago, you would see the front, most of the pages were filled with the party this, the party that, government opens a new factory, cleans up this, gives children this. And then the other big thing was that the media was used to showcase party leaders looking official. You always would see party leaders shaking the hands of other government officials. And these 2 things will continue. We're going to see those, but these 4 points that I put below, I think, have found their way onto the government agenda because I think these are things the government wants to do, that the Communist Party wants to do, and they've discovered that social media is actually a very, very effective way to do these things. And these are all new things. These aren't things that the media traditionally did, and the first one is tackling social problems. That you barely go a day without seeing a new food scandal, a new corruption case, just everything. You see pollution cases, toxic pollution, and they've discovered that social media can actually be a very effective tool for going after this problem, for solving these problems. You see corrupt officials being kicked out. You see polluting factories being closed down after people raise a stink on new media. So that's one thing. Second thing is keeping the public informed. They've really discovered that all these government organizations can open their own Weibo's and their own other sites and really let the public feel like they know what's happening in government. And that sort of leads into the third one, which is encouraging more political participation. I think the government, Xi Jinping and all the rest, they realize that they can't continue to disenfranchise the entire Chinese, non-communist party Chinese population forever. And new media is a way for people to feel like they can have a voice in government. And again, you see this in the corruption cases and these other ones. And then the last one there is just gauging public opinion. It's often difficult for leaders in Beijing to know what's happening on the ground in some of these hot spots because the local officials will never tell them what's happening, whereas with new media, they can just do a search on Wukong and suddenly find 20 people who are twittering from Wukong talking about the city going up in flames and demonstrations and riots. So these are all new things that are happening with the advent of and the rise of new media. And I think that these things will probably continue, maybe plus or minus a pullback from time to time. But I think you're going to see the media, both the new media and as a result of traditional media, doing more of this. Right. So last one there is just a bit about the party line, but I think I'm out of time. So thank you, everybody, and open the floor to questions.
Do you want to stay there?
No, I'll stay up here. I'm still okay.
Okay, well, why don't we throw open the floor to questions then? And while you're thinking about your first question, or yes, we've got one right up here then. Please wait for the microphone and identify yourselves so when you do speak. Here we go. I'm not sure.
Say, yeah, I couldn't. What? Okay, well, hold on. Sure, they'll get it working. Well, that's an interesting question. I think again, it's all dictated by the government. Okay, if the government wants there to be national demonstrations, and the real obvious case is the recent Diaoyutai controversy with Japan. It was very, very similar to a case in 2005 of anti-Japanese demonstrations, and in both of those cases, people did use new media to organize demonstrations, but it's very important to realize that was very much on the government's agenda. The government wanted people to come out and demonstrate and show their anger at Japan because that was sort of an effective way for Beijing to show people how outraged it was over what was happening. If it comes to demonstrations that the government doesn't want, then you'll see just those will be deleted, immediately. And the propaganda ministry is very, very active about staying in touch with social media and traditional media, sort of updating them on what is and isn't allowable. And they watch out for this stuff. And if they see something, a sign of trouble or a particular demonstration taking shape that they don't like, they'll just pick up the phone and call Sina and say, hey, take down anything, regarding Wukong, and it'll go away. So it happens, but only, when the government wants it to happen, which is essentially the situation with all new media. It's when the government wants it to happen that it can happen, but the number of cases that the government wants to happen is growing. The range of what's acceptable is getting much bigger.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions here. Why don't we start in the corner with Ted?
And Douglas, forgive me for not standing up.
Oh, that's
I've got a broken leg and a big cast on it. I don't want to deal with the main part of your talk, but part of it which you referred to, Tiananmen Square. Just after the occurrence, disaster, massacre, whatever you want to call it, I interviewed on television Han Suyin, who I'm sure you know is a member of this club and quite an old friend of a lot of members here,
right.
but was an unrepentant supporter of the PRC government. She said categorically on television, and I'm sure the thing is still there in the archive, no person, not one single person, was killed in Tiananmen Square. In the surrounding streets, yes, and round about there, but Not one person was killed in Tiananmen Square. I've never heard anybody argue with that except the Western press, who I've never met anyone who said, I was there and saw people getting killed. So I've got a completely open mind on it, and I'd just like to hear what your view is.
Well, actually, for my book, I did interview a Xinhua reporter who was actually at Tiananmen on the night of June the 3rd and June the 4th. And he pretty much said what you're saying, which is that they actually negotiated, I don't know if it was the PLA, someone from the government actually came in, and I think Liu Xiaobo, I think, was one of the main negotiators for the students, and the other one, can't remember who the other one was, but I think Liu Xiaobo was one of the main ones, and that they did end up negotiating like 2 or 3 hours for everyone to leave the square. And they said, after that, anything's fair. But it sounds like, from what this guy said and from what I've heard also, it sounds like most people did, leave the square on their own will, because nobody knew what was going to happen when this 2 or 3 hour window expired. And they thought they should probably get out. It's possible 1 or 2 people got killed, but I haven't heard any reports or anybody say there were mass killings in the square.
You get other conflicting reports on that. Joel?
Just curious, to what extent did the impact of all the rumors and revelations connected with Wang Lijian and his race to the consulate and the resulting exposés and the way it exploded in China and around the world, but mostly around the world, but certainly in China also. And of course the impact on the handling of Mr. and Mrs. Poe. How much did that impact on the final handling of the Mr. and Mrs. Poe's case and Mr. Whiteley?
Okay, I mean, that's a good question. I actually looked at that in one of my longer presentations. I just discussed it, just the whole issue of the Bo Xilai and the way it unfolded first in the international media and then later in the domestic media. And I think, again, I come back to what I said earlier, it happened the way it did because they wanted it to happen. I mean, I don't like to make it sound like the Western media was being played like a fiddle by the Chinese, but the Xi Jinping and his group and Hu Jintao, there was definitely a very strong faction in government that wanted Bo Xilai out. And so therefore they were not, I don't think they were feeding information to the Western media, but they weren't trying to stop it either. Whereas we see when something like the New York Times wrote a story about Wen Jiabao's family's wealth, that wasn't a story they really wanted to get out, and therefore they took really draconian action against them. So in terms of the timing, I think the fact that the Western media got it first is probably a product of the fact that they're more aggressive, and the Chinese media aren't allowed to report on that stuff anyhow. They have to wait for the official Xinhua story to come out. So it took the propaganda ministry and all the power brokers in Beijing a few weeks to figure out how are we going to spin this story. And that's this 2-week window that you see between when the Western media started reporting on it and when the Chinese media started reporting on it. And then when the Chinese media started reporting on it, it's all just through Xinhua reports. And so your question, how did the Western media's reports impact what happened? It probably didn't have much impact. I mean, this was stuff that was happening, and again, it was stuff that, that the leaders ultimately wanted to see. These were stories they wanted to get out because they wanted to show Bo Xilai being deposed. It fed into their agenda. And again, one of the things I pointed out in one of my other presentations was, I think, one of the remarkable things about the whole Bo Xilai scandal in general was the fact that it even got reported at all. Because if you look at past cases of inter-party fighting, I looked in like the Cultural Revolution at Lin Biao and Liu Shaoqi, who are 2 of the biggest leaders who got deposed. They just didn't report it. They pretended like it didn't happen. That's what would happen in the old days. Now of course there's too many other ways that people can find out, so it's impossible to to keep things out of the media like that. But they reported on it fairly extensively, and even in the Chinese media, which I think was a big step for for the Communist Party.
Okay, over here, please.
Hi. Hi. My name's Liz Kim. I'm a reporter from South Korea. With a lot of news coming out of, a lot of breaking news coming out of Weibo, and a lot of criticism toward toward Chinese government coming out of the Weibo. Do you detect any change in the nature of Chinese traditional media?
Well, that's why I said, I think during the presentation, I think the traditional media are still very directly controlled by the state. I mean, all the traditional media have a Communist Party secretary, their editors, their top editors, publishers are all Communist Party members. With the new media, it's all privately owned, so it's very different in terms of ownership and control. And the new media is much more, the government's control over new media is much more indirect than it is with traditional media. So what you see happening often is these sort of grassroots taking shape in the new media, and then the traditional media, so they take shape in the new media, and then if the government decides this is a debate we want to happen, this is something we want to let happen, then you start to see the traditional media following in their footsteps. And you saw that in the Guomei case. I was saying a lot of traditional media, which have more resources, really started doing a lot of digging about the Red Cross, and they started uncovering all these, like I say, these cases of forced donations and mismanagement and excessive spending. So it's gotten to the point where it's sort of like Weibo or the new media are almost, they're testing the waters to see what's okay, and then based on, they're the ones pushing the envelope, and then the traditional media sort of follow suit based on on what the new media are finding out.
Over here, please.
I'm To Han-shi from the South China Morning Post. Just two questions. One is, to what extent do you think the Chinese ban on Twitter and Google is due to commercial protectionism for local Chinese equivalents? My second question is, with the new Chinese propaganda chief Liu Yinshan in charge and the new Chinese leader Xi Jinping, do you see them as more open or more restrictive on all this new media going forward?
Okay. Again, I think there's probably a combination of things in terms of why they blocked Twitter and Facebook, and you're saying to what extent is that just trying to protect the local companies and give them an unfair advantage or whatever. I think that plays a certain part in it, and you did hear a lot of talk of that when Google was having trouble, competing with Baidu in the home market, that the government was favoring Baidu over Google, even though Google was registered in China and operating in China. I think that's part of the equation. You always favor the home player wherever you are, probably. I'm sure the U.S. government favors local U.S. companies, in subtle ways versus foreign companies, and likewise in Hong Kong. But I do think a big element of it is it comes down to control. The Chinese government feels much more comfortable picking up the phone and yelling at someone over at Sina or Baidu than they do picking up the phone and yelling at someone at Google. These are big international companies. They've got to be much more careful with these guys than they do with the local players. The local players, they don't have any choice. The government can take away their business license tomorrow and they're screwed. So, it's a little bit of both. I wouldn't say it's completely one or the other. And then I can't remember, what was the second?
With the new Chinese propaganda chief Liu Yinshan in charge of Xi Jinping, will new media be more open and liberalized?
Okay, I really don't know enough about the new propaganda guy to say. Xi Jinping certainly seems to want to be more open. But again, I have to keep stressing the openness isn't because the government is suddenly enlightened. I think it's because it's discovered that the media can have other uses that are useful to the government beyond the traditional propaganda stuff. Again, Xi Jinping has made it known that he wants to fight corruption. That's one of his pet causes. Well, new media, as we saw through the Yang Dacai case, and we got another one here I brought in, but I didn't show you guys. This was just in the paper on Saturday involving, another official in Taiyuan. But you know, the new media are a very effective tool in helping, you know, the government do what it's trying to do. In this case, fight corruption or fight food safety problems or pollution or whatever.
Is the oversight of Xinhua becoming a little less strict? We had something extremely unusual last week when Xinhua put up a many-paragraph story saying that the deputy secretary of Shanxi province had been removed in a discipline investigation prior to, and without any actual announcement of it yet by the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. And then Xinhua pulled the article off the web
They jumped the gun.
within the hour, and then was totally silent on it for about 20 hours, and then put up a one sentence statement saying that he had been removed. So what is your sense of whether Xinhua itself is now responding more to news and less directly to political orders?
I mean, Xinhua is, you know, at the end of the day, it's the government's
Totally.
mouthpiece.
But how do you explain something like that one?
There's got to be a story behind the story with that one.
You
I
haven't
mean,
heard
I
what
have.
it is. Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard what the story is. It sounds like somebody jumped the gun. It's not, and that often happens. Like maybe some, you know, propaganda department person didn't sign off on it before they stuck it out, and somebody thought they had the authority to put it out, but it turned out somebody higher up didn't like the story, or, you know, that sounds very insider, you know, insider mechanisms going on. You know, and Xinhua, I mean, at the end of the day, Xinhua really is the equivalent of, you know, like a PR newswire for the central
That's
government.
why the original story was so surprising. I mean, it said this
Yes.
reporter has learned from members of the Shanxi provincial party standing
Yeah.
committee, and
Well, Xinhua follows the agenda just like everybody else, and they often set the agenda because they have the direct lines to the propaganda ministry. But they are, you know, they're an independent, a relatively independent news agency. The Xinhua reporters I talked to when I was doing my book said they, you know, most of their stories they do on their own initiative. It's not like they get, you know, there's a pipeline or they get a phone call every morning telling them what to write. You know, they actually do generate most of their own stories. And in this case, it sounds like, you know, they know that the government wants to write more about corrupt government officials. Somebody thought he had this great story. They thought they'd do it, and then maybe that official was too close to some central leader than they realized, or something like that.
it was just very interesting. Okay, we got another one here and one more there, and I think we're going to be out of time, unfortunately. One more here, yeah.
Do you think a lot of the Chinese netizens actually do not believe either the social media or the mainstream media? They're smart enough for that, because despite all this manipulation or so-called control you addressed, you still have a lot of protests that happen overnight, whether it's because of chemical pollution, whether it's because of corruption. So obviously either the bosses in Beijing are not in charge, or the average guy is smart enough not to be manipulated anymore.
Well, there is a certain element of cat and mouse involved. And again, this is something I discovered in writing the book, that you know, citizens or reporters or whatever, they're always trying to stay one step ahead of the censors, because the censors won't pick, you know, if you're just writing about, you know, hey, let's all get together at XYZ Cafe, you know, and it's really for a demonstration, you know, it's going to take people a little while to catch on to you, especially if it's not a hot spot or not a spot that people are looking at. And you do see a lot of these daring media that are increasingly, you know, trying to play this game of cat and mouse with the government. You know, they're trying to sort of be one step ahead, you know, because once they catch on to you, then you've got to follow the party line. You got to do what the government says. But you often do have a window, you know, of maybe a few hours, maybe sometimes even a day or two before the government sort of, you know, before the censors or whoever's watching catches on to what's happening. And a lot of people do try to exploit that window to do the kinds of things that you're saying. So you could see some stuff. And I think there are probably also limited cases where the government probably allows some form of organizing at a very local level, like the Wukong protests. You know, they decided this was going to be a case that was going to get lots of national media attention. You know, so someone made a decision that this case was going to go forward and was going to get the national exposure. So in that case, you know, they probably maybe did allow a certain very limited amount of organization to happen on social media.
Okay. And we're 1 minute past our closing time, but one question quickly here in the corner, please.
Hi, I'm Jean Shirley. I'm a wine writer based in Hong Kong, and I've had a Weibo account for about a year, and I've seen how effective the government can be in bringing down even mention about fake wines, for example. Within an hour, that tweet would be erased. So they're not even looking at political areas, but also things that you consider leisure and social activities. My question for you is really about how feasible is this control over social media? Given especially in Shanghai, I have friends who tell me that for a few less than 100 RMB a month, they can actually access Twitter and Facebook, and there's also a lot of codes being sent over Weibo, which means something else. So how do you see control over this from the government, let's say over the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. Well, right now, the thing you're talking about with people getting onto Facebook and Twitter, that's almost always through these VPNs. There's a big drawback. The government tries to interfere a little bit with VPNs and certain ones it'll try to shut down or make inaccessible from China. At the end of the day, the bottom line is that only a very small portion of Chinese can get on these VPNs because they usually require a foreign credit card, because they usually only accept payment in non-renminbi currency, because obviously anyone in China probably won't be able to get into this business. So that's like a real effective control. That said, you know, there is, I was using actually at one point a service provided by Falun Gong, a VPN type service, because they operate a very effective VPN. It's a VPN-like service, but I think it's a VPN. So, you know, there are people who are getting around it, but at this point, it's not, the government doesn't see it as a threat, and for the reason I just said, it's just not that pervasive, it's not accessible to most people. So, you know, if that changes, we'll probably see something like the real name registration, you know, like a big reactionary type move happen to try and crack down on that. But so far, it hasn't been that big of a deal. I also just wanted to respond quickly to your thing about the fake wines. You should realize in cases like that, those are cases where actually it's probably the company itself that's actually taking that action, not as a result of the government. Because a lot of these companies, a lot of them are listed in New York. And, you know, and they also want to adhere to international norms. And you see Alibaba doing this a lot too. They really are trying to crack down on piracy and sale of illegally copied items and stuff on their sites. So that's not necessarily the government doing that. In a lot of cases, that's actually the companies themselves trying to clean up their sites of this pirated, illegal content because they want to be taken seriously. And, you know, they know that that's a risk, you know, to their business if they allow this stuff on. They open themselves to liability, to lawsuits, you know, because they're all traded in the West.
But if you suppress allegations that people are engaged in fake wines, just as, I mean, you do get reports that conflict, as we were talking about earlier, that suggest things are much worse. So don't they undermine their own credibility? It doesn't sound like she was referring to an ad for fake wines. It sounds like she was referring to the problem of fake wines, which suppressing that would not be. Would be undermining confidence in the food and safety system. Do you have a few minutes afterwards? There's still one or two more hands, but if you can stay, we do try to always get people out at 2 o'clock sharp, because that's what keeps everybody coming so regularly for the 60 or 70 of these that we do each year. But thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. And we try to give our guests, our speakers, something to remember the club by.
Thank you.
So.
Hey,
thanks
for having me. Thank you all for coming.